This is the third video on the history of American literature. This one is going to focus more on the first half of the 20th century up until World War II. When we left off of the second video, I was talking about the Industrial Revolution and how it caused a booming economy, but also had a downside. Workers and farmers were adversely affected. Well, in the early 20th century, you're going to see a reform movement begin to grow. We're going to try to get the government to address some of the problems that the people perceived with the Industrial Revolution. And then you're going to see a larger government, more regulations. And this period's known as the Progressive Era, and it goes from the late 1890s to World War I. To start, in 1903, Ida Tarbell published The History of Standard Oil, owned by John D. Rockefeller, at the time the richest man in American history. Originally a series of 19 articles, the book cast Rockefeller as greedy and monopolistic. A classic of muckraking journalism, it was the first such corporate reporting of its kind, and it profoundly affected the way many Americans looked at large corporations and the captains of industry. This, in turn, encouraged the reform movement of the Progressive Age and ultimately led to an anti-monopoly suit against Standard Oil. So it was a powerful book in shifting public opinions about big business. Another bestseller that encouraged progressive reforms was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in 1906. Technically a novel in fiction, the book still revealed the horrible conditions in the meatpacking industry. It outraged readers and contributed to new progressive government regulations of food. Disparate reforms going on during the Progressive Age. One area of particular interest was in education. Many people thought the educational system needed completely revamping, and that included the University of Chicago's John Dewey. Dewey wrote the famous book Democracy in Education, and what he argued was that sitting up there basically lecturing to young students wasn't the best way to teach. Students needed to have group discussions, they need to have experiments, they needed to get involved, and that would stimulate their mind more and to make for a better education. Of course, his ideas were ahead of their time. Now, you might think that because progressive era reformers are trying to make America better, they would look at the Jim Crow segregation laws that were prevalent at the time, especially in the South, and they would see we need to reform those. We need to help out the African Americans in their struggle for civil rights. You might think that, but of course that was not the case. People of the progressive era were products of their own racist age, and the progressives wanted to make society better, and they saw African Americans, of course, obviously incorrectly, inferior, and they said if we empower African Americans, then what we're going to do is hurt society, which is not what they're trying to do. And so the progressive era reformers did nothing to battle the Jim Crow segregation laws. And this then raised the question from among African Americans, how should they battle Jim Crow segregation laws? And it's going to lead to a couple of major African American reformers. The first was probably most famous, Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave and became a major advocate for African American education. He wrote his autobiography, Up from Slavery, and it was a bestseller. It was first published in 1901. Booker T. Washington argued that since African Americans were a relative minority, and since the majority believed that they were inferior, if they were activists, if they were protesting, what would happen is it would anger the majority so much who believed that they were inferior, it would actually strengthen prohibitions on African American rights. And it would hurt the African American cause. What African Americans had to do, Booker T. Washington argued, was address the underlying racist assumption of inferiority, and then the laws would follow. And so the way he saw African Americans doing that is getting an education, primarily in the jobs that were available to them at the time, proving that they were essential to the nation, and in time the white racism would fade away, the laws would fade away, and the blacks would have equality. While Booker T. Washington remained a leader in the African American community, not all African Americans agreed with this more compromised, accommodationist stance. Wbe Du Bois was one. After earning a PhD in history from Harvard in 1895, Du Bois taught at Wilberforce College in Ohio, the University of Pennsylvania, and finally Atlanta University, openly criticizing Booker T. Washington in his book The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. W.B. Du Bois rejected the call for patience and the exclusive call for manual and industrial skills. Du Bois argued for more protests and more litigation. Du Bois asked, what are the talented tenth, the top 10% of African Americans who were already educated and who already had excellent credentials? Were they expected to take industrial jobs as well? As progressivism spread across America near the turn of the 20th century, and African Americans debated how they should address the racism and Jim Crow that went along with it, imperialism grew as well. Now, one of the most imperialist presidents was Theodore Roosevelt, who was president from 1901 to 1908. Roosevelt was a prolific writer, probably one of the greatest American writers, one of the greatest American presidential writers, I should say. He crafted well over a dozen books, and he wrote a number of well-regarded naval histories. Not only did Roosevelt write a lot of books and wrote, as I say, some major naval histories, he increased the U.S. Navy during his presidency. He created what was called the Great White Fleet because the ships were painted white. Well, his sense that we need to build up our naval force came from a book that was strongly influential in what he did. It was written by a Captain Alfred T. Mahan. It was entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History and was first published in 1890. Mahan argued that it didn't matter if you got colonies, which of course Roosevelt wanted to do, if you couldn't trade with them because you didn't have control of the high seas. Someone could just rob you or keep you from trading with your colony. And so Captain Mahan argued that a modern nation should build up their navy. And Roosevelt just took that to heart. And as I say, he built this Great White Fleet. Here's a picture of Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. Many countries still had wooden ships, and the Great White Fleet was all steam-powered metal ships, and they had electricity through the steam and rotating turrets. And it really made the United States a major imperialist power in the early 20th century. I want to turn our attention now to the 1920s, which wasn't at all like the pre-World War I era of the Progressive Age. The economy boomed, and the 20s became known as the Roaring 20, and the culture was changing dramatically. It's often called the Jazz Age. Attitudes were different, and all of this was reflected in the literature of the day. In total, the 1920s proved one of the most productive periods in American literary history. During the Progressive Age, many people looked upon the rich captains of industry as kind of like robber barons. They were living off the blood and sweat and tears of the workers. And this is just going to change in the booming 1920s. People are going to begin to look at the rich people as sort of job providers, as almost divinely ordained. They were smart, they were creative, and they created jobs. You can see this new attitude in a best-selling book in the 1920s by a man named Bruce Barton, and it was called The Man Nobody Knows. What it was it looked at the story of Jesus Christ as kind of like a business entrepreneur and said Christ was a great businessman. I mean, he started with only 12 employees and he ended up having, millions of employees, so to speak. Now, we may look at it as a bit sacrilegious today, but it is an example of the businessman being something that is something to be admired and not somebody that is just sort of riding the backs of others like they believed in the Progressive Age. In the 1920s, you're going to see the proliferation of a number of weekly magazines that hadn't existed before. One was Time magazine. These types of new magazines would go into more in depth than just the newspaper. You also see the beginnings, by the way, of something called Reader's Digest, which was a smart idea. This couple would go and buy the rights to articles that had been published, and they were cheaper because they'd already been published in other magazines. And what they do is they break them down to just the gist of the article and then combine them in one regular publication, the Reader's Digest. And it was a big hit. Among the weekly magazines that were very popular in the 1920s, the most popular was probably Saturday Evening Post. And it became famous because it had on its covers in the 1920s a number of paintings by the famed painter Norman Rockwell, who would always show humorous depictions of everyday American life. But when you get to really more serious writers, fiction writers and nonfiction writers, you come to what was called the lost generation of writers. These writers sort of reflected the end of World War One and an attitude that had grown from World War One. You know that in World War One we're going to die tomorrow, and all this patriotism doesn't mean anything, and it's all kind of democracy doesn't work, and I just want to party now because it's not worth sacrificing. You know, that's why they're called the lost generation, because they're kind of pessimistic, and they would hang out in restaurants and bars and smoke and drink and write literature that was often kind of critical of American life and the economy. But it was some of the greatest American literature ever. One of the more famous of the lost generation was H.L. Mencken. He was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun who founded the magazine American Mercury, which was a monthly. American Mercury, published by Alfred Knopf, was soon considered required reading for cultural radicals. It decried the conformity of Americans, to use Mencken's words, quote, the boobery of American culture. Most Americans thought they were hell on wheels, but they were uncultured and ignorant. For Mencken, idealism, democracy, organized religion, prohibition were all exercises in futility and ignorance. Americans were mostly peasants, boobs, hillbillies, kind of harsh. Another famous writer was Walter Lippman, arguably one of the more famous print journalists America's ever produced. Before the war, he was an optimistic, progressive supporter of Teddy Roosevelt. After the war, however, he became pessimistic, rejecting the core values of democracy. He didn't think rule by majority would work because the people just weren't fit to rule. They formed their opinions based on fragmentary information on public issues. They didn't have the complete story. They were, they believed what they heard in the media, and they could be manipulated by those in authority. And he cited World War I propaganda as an example. They were always subject to stereotypes and prejudice, he believed. Other members of the lost generation include Cedric Lewis. He published in 1920 Main Street, in which he condemned small-town life. He created a fictional Midwestern farm town he called Gopher Prairie, which depicted its citizens as smug but ignorant, sort of in a boring culture. In 1922, he published Babbitt, in which he created a fictional middle-aged real estate agent trapped in a stifling middle-class conformity. Later, he published Elmer Gantry in 1927, which condemned popular religion. You might be familiar with the classic Burt Lancaster movie of the same title. Perhaps the most famous writer of the Lost Generation was the writer Ernest Hemingway. He had served as a Red Cross volunteer on the Italian front in World War I, and thus much of his writings saw patriotism and wartime idealism as kind of silly. His Sun Also Rises, published in 1926, described groups of Americans shattered by the war as they drifted around Spain. More famous was his 1929 book A Farewell to Arms, which powerfully depicted a war's futility and all the inflamed rhetoric. Hemingway had a terse, pared-down writing style. It was very successful, but he kind of remained unhappy and pessimistic. Hemingway would live in Key West and part of the time in Cuba, about as far away from the United States as you can get, and still be near the United States. He wrote at a bar called Sloppy Joe's, and ultimately he killed himself. There was also F. Scott Fitzgerald, who famously in 1925 wrote the bestseller Great Gatsby, in which he described the moral and spiritual disillusion of his own lost generation. To whom he said, "All gods were dead, all wars fought, and all faiths shaken." One of the last writers you may associate with the lost generation was William Faulkner, although he was more popular in the 1930s and is often thought of as more of the, he wrote about the American South, and so he's associated primarily with that area of the country. But look at some of his books, like his famous As I Lay Dying. They're not happy books that he wrote, and are kind of that way indicative of the lost generation. In the 1920s, there's also a real growth in African American literature, and not only literature, but music and art. And all this took place in New York City and became known as the Harlem Renaissance. It's an interesting backstory here. With World War I, a number of African Americans were moving from the rural South, where they lived as sharecroppers, to the urban North, where there were factories making war goods and there were defense contracts. Well, when they got up north, turns out that the white Northerners didn't want them anywhere near and pushed them out. And in New York City, that meant that they were pushed northward on Manhattan Island above Central Park into the area of Harlem. And here, because of the de facto segregation, the de facto Jim Crow, they had to create their own society from the scratch. So they were, this area of New York City became sort of a black mecca with its own black markets, its own black doctors, and its own black culture, including black literature. One of the more famous of the Harlem Renaissance writers was James Weldon Johnson, who actually was appointed by President Roosevelt to high government positions and was a leader in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and a prominent civil rights activist. But he published throughout the 1920s a number of poems and novels and anthologies collecting the poems and spirituals of sort of documenting black culture, like the Book of American Negro Poetry shown here. And he wrote the autobiography of an ex-colored man. So he's one of the more famous of the Harlem Renaissance writers. Another significant writer of the Harlem Renaissance was Claude McKay. He came from Jamaica, where he'd gotten his start as a poet. And in 1922, he published Harlem Shadows, which was a compilation of his poems. And it showed some of the defiance, some of the poems he wrote. For example, If We Must Die and To the White Friends were some of the poems he wrote. It became real famous. McKay later turned to prose, and he wrote things like Home to Harlem and novel like Banjo, and he later published his autobiography, A Long Way from Home. Another talented writer was Jean Tumer. He had studied in France, where he developed a real, sense of introspection, and by the way, kind of like a left bank, heavy drinking, counterculture type guy. He published the novel Cain in 1923, and it sort of contrasted lives of poor blacks in Georgia with the rich blacks in New York City, and it really ranked up there with Harlem Shadows as a famous work. Interesting, though, after Tumer published Cain, he sort of just suddenly retired from writing right at his most famous. One of the more prolific Harlem Renaissance writers, and probably one of its most well-known, was Langston Hughes. He wrote novels, plays, and essays, and he was supported by his white, rich, liberal friends as long as he evoked the African soul. But when he began to talk about poor blacks in New York City, he lost a lot of support. He lived an incredible life, lived all over the world, and but he didn't always, moan or cry. Some of his writing was funny and moving. Really talented writer. At the end of the 1920s, of course, came the stock market crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Great Depression of the 30s saw a number of books published describing the misery of poverty and the troubles of the average American. Most famous and impactful of the Depression-era books was John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, first published in 1939. It told the story of poor Okies that were threatening their livelihood. Their livelihood was threatened by the infamous Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which you can see some pictures of here. And they went west to California for a better life. And it was sort of a fictitious story, but a lot of people did that. And by the way, when they went to the Southern California in the Great Depression, they followed the U.S. Highway Route 66, and it became Highway 66. Of course, you think of today as being sort of a kitsch in the 1950s, but it began becoming famous with all the migration from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and it was made famous by John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Not all of the famous books in the Great Depression were fiction. There was a couple of books by two sociologists, Robert and Helen Merrill Lynn. And in the 1920s, the Lynns had gone to Muncie, Indiana, a town in the middle of America, and they thought was representative of Middle America, and which they called Middle America. And they did a sociological study of how the 1920s and all the booming economy and changing culture affected people in Middle America, and they documented how profoundly it affected them. Well, when the Great Depression came in the 1930s, the Lynns went back to Muncie, Indiana, and published a sequel called Middletown in Transition. And here they concluded that despite the really bad economy and the Great Depression and all the pain and hurt, the people in Middletown, Muncie, Indiana, they still maintained their belief in capitalism and democracy. They did not adapt any type of radicalism. And these two studies are still used in sociology today. After the Great Depression of the 1930s came, of course, World War II in 1941. American literature flourished during World War II. Books symbolized freedom. Posters quoted President Franklin Roosevelt, quote, "Books cannot be killed by fire. People die, but books never die. No man and no force can put thought in a concentration camp forever. No man and no force can take from the world the books that embody man's eternal fight against tyranny. In this war, we know, books are weapons," unquote. During the war, an independent writers' war board formed to promote the American ideals, which of course was propagandistic. Most of the books that Americans published during World War II were sort of propagandistic. I just want to mention one book that wasn't an American, but obviously was profoundly impactful in World War II. Adolf Hitler's biography, Mein Kampf, or it means in German, Mein Battle, or My Struggle. He wrote it in the 1920s when he was in prison, and he outlined his belief that the German people, the German Volk, were Aryans, and they should have their place at the head of Europe. And it was obviously an influential book and contributed to the rise of the Nazis in World War II. In any event, this concludes the third video on the history of American literature, and this one from the early 1900s through World War II.